If we have 19,000 new vacant parcels, what then? Who gets access to the vacant land? Can we actually rebuild? Understanding that it's harder for Black and Brown developers to actually get financing or to have access to equity to do development projects. Who is going to rebuild our city? And what does that new city look like?
That's the voice of Chase Cantrell. He's the executive director of Building Community Value. Later in the show, we're going to do a deep dive on why that big $250 million bond proposal from Mayor Mike Duggan's administration failed before Detroit City Council this week. But first, we check in on stories around the region. I'm Jairus Days, and this is episode 381 of your Daily Detroit for Wednesday, November 20th, 2019. Let's get started after we thank our members, including our newest one, Dennis. Dennis, in the words of Hank and John Green, did not forget to be awesome. You can be like Dennis and join us at patreon.com/dailydetroit. And thank you. So how friendly are local cities to LGBTQ people? New scorecards are in for the city of Detroit and some key suburbs from the Human Rights Campaign. The annual evaluation takes a combination of public data and answers from city officials. It gives a snapshot of what the advocacy group says are places that support LGBTQ people who work and live there. They look at a variety of factors on a city level for the scorecard, including non-discrimination laws for employment, public accommodations, municipal services that are friendly to LGBTQ communities, domestic partner benefits offered to city workers, FBI hate crime statistics, and more. The city of Ferndale and Detroit both scored perfect 100 out of 100s. Pleasant Ridge came middle of the pack with 55. Meanwhile, both Warren and Sterling Heights were at the very bottom. In Macomb County, Warren scored a 14 and Sterling Heights just an 8 out of 100 for supporting LGBTQ people, according to the Human Rights Campaign. Demolition has begun of the Detroit Saturday Night Building. The 1914 structure on West 4th Street is being taken down for 12 parking spots to support the luxury condo development next door. Downtown Detroit already devotes 40% of its land to parking, with much of it being surface parking lots. Preservationists tried to get a historic designation for the structure, but that proved futile before Detroit City Council, as the development the parking lot is for, the Fort Shelby, was backed by city retiree pension money, and the developer, Emmett Moten, said that they won't be able to sell the rest of the units and pay back the fund without this dedicated parking. For context, there are surface parking lots to the left, to the right, across the street, and on the other side of the same block of the demolished building. Although it's private property and he's going to do what he's going to do with it, nobody moved to Detroit for the surface parking lots, or at least that's my opinion. This kind of land use is part of why downtown Detroit, as far as actual residents per square mile, is less population dense than Ferndale. A public notice filed with the state of Michigan says that more than 70 workers will be laid off due to the closure of the Canton sugar refinery in Taylor. Canton is controlled by Michigan Sugar. You might know the brands on store shelves as Pioneer and Big Chief. The employees are represented by the United Food and Commercial Workers Local 876, and the plant is scheduled to close in mid-February of next year. Joining me on the line is Chase Cantrell. He is from Building Community Value. Welcome to Daily Detroit.
Happy to be with you.
So to set the table a little bit, so people who don't know you, what exactly is Building Community Value and what do you do there?
So Building Community Value is a Detroit-based nonprofit. We've been around since 2016. And really the organization springs up out of the idea that it should be Detroiters who are rebuilding the city of Detroit. So we have training courses twice a year. These are 3-month-long intensive trainings where we teach Detroiters what it means to be a developer. So this isn't the nuts and bolts, how do you install a window? This is how do you create a pro forma? How do you approach banks and commercial development financial institutions? How do you bring the resources to a project to actually get a project done in the neighborhoods of the city? So, we're really trying to empower Detroiters who have a vision of what their neighborhood should be to have the tools that they need to actually reimagine and rebuild their neighborhoods.
So that's one of the reasons why I thought it would be interesting to talk to you about everything that's happening with this bond proposal. I know that you went to the hearing last night, and you've also been following the coverage, as have I, online. I think first off, let's set the table. What exactly was being asked for here?
Sure. So the way that this sort of initiative begins is that the executive, that the mayor's administration, had to present a proposal to city council for approval. And they what the administration asked for was a $250 million authorization to go to the financial markets to get a bond for the city of Detroit to remove 19,000 vacant structures. So it's been dubbed the blight bond. And apparently, the city has already torn down about the same number of structures. They're about halfway through their goal, so they've already torn down about 19,000. And we've run out of federal dollars, the hardest hit funds. So the administration was going to city council to ask for the authorization to get this bond. And the goal really, if it had passed council, it would have gone on to the March ballot for the residents of the city of Detroit to vote on. So that was what the request was. The request was simply to be able to go on the private markets to get this financing.
Well, there's been a ton of national coverage about all the demolition happening in Detroit, but the hearings have been very contentious and frankly very well attended. What was it like, and what's kind of the core of the opposition to this bond?
First, I just want to shout out the legislative policy division of the city of Detroit. I don't know if many listeners just know how much due diligence and research has to go into vetting a proposal of this type, and it is really that division of city government that really does the deep dive into what the legal consequences of certain proposals are, how this can be implemented, how city council can and cannot act in response to the proposal. So they put out a lot of information regarding this and really help the public to understand what the bond is about. Like you said, I was in the room yesterday. The city council asked to have a special meeting. It was not required, but they had a special community meeting that started at 5 p.m. yesterday, and it was standing room only. I've never seen city council chambers that packed. They actually had to disallow some folks coming up to the 13th floor, just given that there was no seating left. So it was very much well attended, and residents really cared about this issue on both sides, for yes and for no. On the no side, though, there were so many diverse concerns from State Senator Stephanie Chang, who showed up, with her young baby in tow, in fact, citing environmental hazards. There have been a number of environmental complaints against the city recently. So in 2019, regarding asbestos and other environmental hazards that have not been safely remediated in some of these demolitions. A lot of people were talking about process and controls. So the Auditor General for the city of Detroit, Mark Lockridge, recently put out a report that was just honestly quite devastating for the administration, citing problems with inconsistent and unreliable demolition data, controls that were not properly in place, just a number of different facets of mismanagement. And for this Auditor General's report to have been released, I think this was released last week, the timing was certainly bad for the administration. And I think in some respects that colored the council's final vote. For a lot of people, this came down to trust and confidence. Is there enough transparency? Is there enough trust in the current processes that are in place to then be able to entrust the administration with not only $250 million, because that's what we're talking about with this particular proposal, but the city is also using an additional $50 million per year over the next 5 years out of the general fund for blight remediation. So that's $500 million, not even counting interest, that this administration would be using for blight. So, if we can't have trust in our government to actually use those funds correctly, is this the right moment in our evolution as a city and being able to handle these kinds of governmental initiatives to allow our administration to do this kind of work? Again, lots of different people. There were 200 comment cards that were filled out yesterday, 200, and city council stayed until everyone had their say. So people really, really seem to care about this.
Well, it is $500 million. And that report really showed some of the things that some reporters and watchdogs had been kind of talking about with the administration. And then when this report came out, it was something where all those things that were kind of chatted about, it seemed to give them a lot of steam.
I think that's exactly right. And President Brenda Jones, president of the city council, said very often that, what they're trying to do, they're not trying to delay anything, but they're trying to do their proper due diligence. And I think what the Auditor General's report showed was that there wasn't necessarily true transparency in the kind of information that the Auditor General was requesting from the city. So, there's a question of what the true data is. Do we actually have a good snapshot understanding of what our demolition program actually looks like and how it functions now? And can we put remedies in place to get processes correct before we actually allow the administration to continue the demolition program at even a greater scale? So the timing, depending on how you look at it, either the timing was great or the timing was terrible. But luckily we had this additional data point to allow the city council to do their analysis.
Well, and to be fair to the mayor's side, why is it that they're pushing so much demolition right now and at the speed that they're doing?
Well, I think one is because we've run out of federal funds. So Mayor Duggan has made it clear that that source of funding has run dry. So we have to figure out if we want to continue doing demolitions at this pace. They've gained momentum over time. They want to continue the pace that they've already established, that they'd have to find a different source. So the source is the pocketbooks of taxpayers. So these are unlimited general tax obligations. So this comes out of property taxes, and that was the proposal, to be able to continue the current pace of demolition. And also, I mean, I think your point is well taken. To the mayor's credit, there's been quite a bit of negotiation. So David Masseron and Arthur Jemison for the city submitted this proposal to council in September, and since September, there's been with city council, with community development organizations, with other community stakeholders, there have been negotiations to modify the original proposal. So the proposal actually got much longer and refined in some ways. Some of these provisions went from saying, it is the intent of the administration, very
words that leave
superfluous language.
Yeah, exactly. Words that leave you a way out.
Exactly. Not some things that aren't quite binding, to language that says that the administration will. So there certainly was progress being made, but I think that a lot of community members thought that even the very principle, the philosophy behind this proposal was misguided.
So you have a very interesting view in that you actually work on projects and help people do projects in the neighborhoods. You're not somebody who's limited to downtown like so many of the stories that we see in the news. What is your take on this from where you sit as far as impact, and do you think this is something that will eventually happen, or was this denial something where we're going to kind of reconsider what we're doing here?
So I think the framing was wrong. So for me, day in and day out, I'm interfacing with Detroit residents who have a vision for their neighborhoods. They come into the program, having seen a vacant house across from where they live or somewhere on their block, or having seen a vacant commercial space, and they already have a sense of what they want to, how they want to transform their communities. They just don't know where to start. Or even if they've done rehabs before, they don't really know how to formalize their practices. So the idea that we need to remove blight by demolition as the only strategy or as the primary strategy, to me, is misguided. Without a doubt, I don't think anyone believes that demolition shouldn't happen. There are certainly structures that can't be saved, that are dangerous for community members, that present a true hazard and nuisance for neighbors, that need to come down. Everyone who attended yesterday's meetings and today's meeting, I think everyone can agree that some demolition needs to happen. But so much more, I think, can be salvaged. And I didn't hear a great deal of conversation from the administration, or frankly, questions from city council about how these properties are triaged, how these 19,000 parcels have been identified, and what various conditions they're in that make them unsalvageable. So for me, our focus really should be on rebuilding the city much more than tearing things down without a plan for rehabilitation. And I think that we've seen historically across communities of color across the U.S. that whether you call it slum clearance, whether you call it blight remediation, whatever term you use, you're clearing land, usually for systemic reasons. You're clearing land, and then what happens after? So when I spoke at City Council last night, my suggestion to council members were to ask themselves the question, what next? What happens next? If we have 19,000 new vacant parcels, what then? Who gets access to the vacant land? Can we actually rebuild? Understanding that it's harder for Black and brown developers to actually get financing or to have access to equity to do development projects. Who is going to rebuild our city? And what does that new city look like? So for me, fundamentally, even thinking about creating more vacant land in the city of Detroit, I want to think about, well, what happens then? How do we rebuild and who's rebuilding? And I'm concerned that we don't have the ecosystem where it would be Detroiters who are rebuilding their city.
That strikes me as a on point observation, because when I think about who's sitting at the table when we're covering developments, or just looking at the places when we go cover developments, it's not a diverse group that's a part of it. There's usually a few people that are out there of color, but rarely people at the table with power. One of the things that strikes me when you're saying all of this is when I talked to the head of the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation up on Mackinac earlier this year, and I'll put a link to that conversation in the show notes, is that there is this very high priority of clearing land and having land that's able to be assembled for large developments. Basically, he said there's lots of large developments that want to come to the city, usually folks, corporations, etc. But their problem is that they don't have that many parcels of land that are big enough to put them on. What do you think of that as a development strategy, and how that fits into the mix?
Well, one of the things that came out of this proposal was an offering from the city to begin to revise our master plan. We have not had a true full revision of our master plan in Detroit in a very long time. And we've been doing piecemeal sort of neighborhood plans that the city is going to continue, but we don't have anything that really brings it all together so that, as a foundational basis, everyone's pulling from the same book.
What was Detroit Future City then, that big book that everybody got a few years ago? So that was not a master plan.
That was not a master plan adopted by the city of Detroit. Detroit Future City, I think, has evolved into a very significant organization within the city of Detroit. But at the time, that initial planning that happened, there was an extensive amount of community engagement and community input. And it was a sort of visioning for the future, right? This was supposed to be the plan that could guide development in Detroit for the next 50 years, but it was not something that was ever adopted by city government. So we do not have a true updated master plan at the city level. When you have these large developers who are considering how do you bring together parcels to do larger developments, if we can't point to a master plan and say, well, yes, that fits into the fabric and the footprint of what we're trying to create in this part of the city or this neighborhood, it becomes very, very much piecemeal development that allows those with resources and networks to do larger development projects, oftentimes at the detriment of community members who may not have the same kind of amassed power. So I understand what that leader is saying, but at the same time, we don't have a guidebook for ourselves. And that's my greatest concern. So out of this proposal, we began to see at least some intention from the city to work towards that master plan. So I think that's a good starting point for future conversation. Really, before we even think about blight remediation, how do we get to a master plan that allows us to know and answer the question, what next?
So I guess that leads me right into the very tactical or practical what next. If we're not talking about, say, this high level what next, what is next?
Well, I think a few things will happen. One, I think that this is not the end. We will hear again from the administration. I think they're going to go back to the drawing board and bring something back to council. So I think that will happen. When I mentioned that there's an allocation of $50 million from our projected surpluses from our general fund that will go towards blight remediation, that money likely still will be allocated for that purpose, right? So it's not as though we're going down to zero. There is still some amount of funding in our budget that will go to blight remediation. And for emergency demolitions and for demolitions in some of the most necessary areas of the city, there is still money that we can use for that. So I think in the very short term, that's the what next. City Council goes into recess on the 26th of November. So there's not really much time to debate the next version of this proposal. But I think in 2020, something will come back.
Well, Chase, thank you so much for giving such an on-the-ground perspective what's happening with this bond proposal. I got to tell people, though, that how can they get involved with what you're doing with building community value?
Sure. So our applications for our winter 2020 class are currently open. We're accepting applications through December 6th. So if a listener is a resident of Detroit, Hamtramck, or Highland Park, they're eligible to apply, and they can go to bcvdetroit.org.
And I will have a link in the show notes. Thank you so much, Chase, for spending some time with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Before I let you go, thank you to our community that makes this show possible. It was Thank You Patrons Day yesterday, and we are very grateful. We're planning some live appearances. Dollar Beers with Daily Detroit is one idea, so let's get together. Make sure to send your ideas and feedback on any interviews or stories we do to dailydetroit@gmail.com. We love to hear from you. Also, one of our contributors, our man about town, Devin O'Reilly, he got engaged. So congrats to you and your fiance. He'll be back on the show very soon with his monthly roundup of places to go. We're coming up on the end of the year, so it's time to focus on where you can get a little bit more cozy. So I'm looking forward to talking to him about that. And finally, thanks to you for listening to Your Daily Detroit. I am Jair Sayes. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.